Hi, I'm Ashley, and today I'm going to talk about thick, chunky yarn. So these are yarns that are weight 5, 6, or 7. And a lot of time these yarns are very, very appealing. They're very soft and they just make you want to touch and squish them. But there are definitely some tricks and tips to make working with them easier and in terms of selecting proper projects for use with these thick, chunky yarns. So the basic steps of working with these is, first gather your tools. So you'll need your chunky yarn. You'll need a crochet hook and maybe a darning needle. And then you'll need to select your pattern or what technique you're going to use. But each of those has different considerations. So let's dive in about each of those areas and talk about some information and tips that I have for each of those kind of sections of preparation. In terms of the yarn, it can come in many different materials, just like your not bulky heavyweight yarns. So it can come in acrylic or acrylic blends, which are usually like a little bit stiffer. They're more durable, so they're great for things like backpacks or rugs. It can also come in cotton. And so for cotton, you might want to choose a cotton yarn for something like clothing or cowls. They're going to be heavier weight because they're bulky, but the cotton is going to be a little bit softer and be a little bit more comfortable and have a little bit more drape to it. It can also come in wool or different types of wool blends, which are also a great choice for clothing, but they are going to have more specific care instructions than an acrylic or a cotton yarn. So if you are making something with a wool or wool blend yarn, just be aware of the considerations for how to wash and care for it. The bulky yarns also come in a variety of like shapes and textures as well. So this is just kind of a standard circle. But this one actually, it's not twisted like normal yarn fibers are. So if you look at this yarn, I don't know if you can tell, but it's a bunch of fibers that are twisted together to make it thicker. This one is, I don't even know how they made this, but it's not twisted. So it's a little bit different. And then I have this one here, which isn't as heavy, but this is it's not real like velvet, but it's like a velvety yarn. It's made of polyester, but so some of them are going to be twisted like more traditional yarns, and then some are going to be not like that. You can also have flat like t-shirt ribbon yarns. So something like a t-shirt or ribbon yarn, you might want to use for something like a backpack or a rug, but you probably wouldn't want to use it for clothing. They have different like eyelash yarns or, fuzzy ones that have things coming off. And that might be good for something like a baby blanket that you want to be really fuzzy. So just be conscious of what type of yarn you're using and what project you're going to use it for. So whether you're buying yarn specifically for a project or you're trying to find a project for yarn that you already have, you'll want to take into consideration the texture of your yarn. In regards to the hook that you'll need for crocheting with bulky yarn, you might have to specifically buy a hook for this project. So most of your packs of hooks are going to go up to a size J, which is a size 10 or 6 millimeter hook. So, that's pretty big, but most of your bulky yarns, if you go based on package instructions, are going to call for at least a size K, which is a 6.5 millimeter hook. And so some packs come with that, but not all. And some projects you're going to want an even larger hook, like this one. This is a size N, which this one's not even labeled with the millimeters, so I don't know. But you can tell it's significantly larger than the K. So I could look it up, but I don't feel like it right now. But you're going to possibly have to buy a specific hook for this project. One thing to note also is that, this is an aluminum, just kind of like all of my traditional hooks, but they do come in other materials like plastic or even like a bamboo hook. So the aluminum hooks slide through the yarn for the most part really well. But if you have a really slippery yarn or you're struggling, sometimes the plastic hooks are a little bit better. They don't slide through quite as much. And bamboo, it kind of depends on the hook itself, whether it's going to be really smooth and slidey or not. So just something to note. And how it feels in your hand. You might have a personal preference on the material or the size of the handle, things like that. I do find the larger hooks a little bit more comfortable to hold than the smaller hooks. It's just a little bit more to grab onto. And so you're not pinching, a really small thing for a long time, but they are heavier. So you can get some hand fatigue with these. I notice also, I have a whole video about how to hold the hook. There's the knife grip, which is like this. And then there's the pencil grip. I find when I'm working with the larger hook and bulkier yarns, I like the knife grip better. It, for me, results in less hand fatigue, but you might want to just kind of play with it if you're noticing that you're having a little bit more trouble working with bulkier yarns if you normally work with normal weight or even finer yarns. So something to think about, but you'll probably have to buy a specific hook for your project. There are also options of doing the finger crocheting or hand crocheting method. So if you have a really thick yarn, you might skip the hook altogether and do it with your fingers. But that's kind of a whole different technique and a different style. So something to consider though. Another tool that I like to have on hand is a darning needle. So I like to use darning needles to weave in my ends. And if I'm sewing squares together where I don't want a specific stitch, like a specific crochet stitch joint, I'll use a darning needle. I find it easier than a crochet hook. Not everybody's the same. But if you're going to use a darning needle like I do, and you're going to use bulky yarns, you're going to need a larger darning needle. So this one's plastic, but something like this, where it's got a much larger eye so that you can use it for your bulkier yarns. What I found is the most common search term for this would be jumbo darning needle. So if you just search for jumbo darning needle on Amazon or look for them in the craft stores, they're going to be next to all the other darning needles, but you can find some jumbo ones. They do have jumbo ones in metal as well. So I have both here. Whatever you prefer on those. In terms of the technique you're going to use for crocheting with jumbo or bulky yarn, you want to make sure if you're choosing a pattern that you are choosing a pattern that's made for bulky yarn. So typically on, on pattern websites, you can filter by yarn weight. So if you're looking that way, you can just filter by the weight of yarn you have. If you're going to choose a pattern that's not made for bulky yarn specifically, you want to be conscious of what techniques it's using, because some stitches and techniques just don't work well or don't look great with bulky yarn. So if you're going to use a specific, if you're going to do a pattern that you're just kind of ad-libbing and gonna do a blanket for, let's say, and you're just going to choose a stitch to do the whole time, there are some considerations with the stitches. So some of those stitches that can work well with bulky yarns are your basic, just foundational crochet stitches. So your single, double, half double crochet stitches are going to look really nice with bulky yarn. If you go for kind of a fancier stitch, a lot of times the details are lost because the yarn is so bulky anyway. So it's harder, and you're not going to see the details, and it's just going to look kind of like a jumbled mess potentially. So sticking with one of those kind of basic crochet stitches is really beneficial and helps the yarn really shine. Another stitch you could choose is a V-stitch. So basically a V-stitch is often double crochets. So that's, basically another version of the foundational stitches, but it adds just a little bit of some directionality and a little bit more texture than working just straight in rows of the stitch. A herringbone stitch is another option, which is similar to the V-stitch in terms of just adding a little bit more texture and some directionality to your basic crochet stitches. Another option is to do back loop only or the front or back post stitches. So these, again, getting a theme, they're basically foundational crochet stitches, but you're working in just the back loop or the back post. If you don't know how to do those, I have videos on that. You can just search my channel for back loop, back post stitches. But what they end up doing is they create ridges in the pattern, and it adds some texture and a little bit of dimensionality. It can make it look a little bit like cozier and fluffier. So it's a really good option for your bulky yarns. You could also do a puff, a bobble, or a popcorn stitch. So these could be a little bit overwhelming in bulky yarn because it's going to add a lot of thickness, and the bulky yarn's already really thick. But if you're going for something that's just super, super thick and plush and cozy, you could choose that. Just be aware, it might be a little overwhelming. Sometimes a puff stitch might call for 5 or 6 crochets in the same stitch. You might want to go down to 3 or something. So it's just something to look at, but also know you're going to use a lot of yarn using those stitches. So just be aware, but it's going to create a very luscious, cushy project at the end if you do choose one of those stitches. So another option is doing like a tapestry crochet pattern, and those will look really good in the thick bulky yarns because they're still those basic crochet stitches, but the color changing will really pop. So it would be a nice option for like a rug. If you want something a little bit more colorful and with some variety, the tapestry crochet technique would be a good choice. In terms of the type of things that you're going to make with thick crochet, thick yarn, obviously it's thick, it's heavy, it's going to be warmer, cushier, right? So you're not going to make something that you're trying to do open work, light, flowy, but do understand that the thicker yarns are usually going to end up in a slightly stiffer end product. I mean, you can crochet it loosely, but the yarn itself is not going to have as much flow and drape to it. So things like chunky cowls or really chunky scarves, rugs, really thick blankets or afghans, bags, so backpacks, handbags, purses. You can make socks, slippers, boot cuffs, anything you want to be thick and cozy, mug cozies, coasters, beanies, you get it. The list really can go on, but you do want to consider the purpose of the project and how you want the end project to look. If you want it to be drapey, flowy, you're probably not going to want to choose a thick yarn. If you want it to be soft, cozy, cushy, go for it. Choose that just squishable yarn that you couldn't keep your hands off of at the store. Another thing to consider when you're working with chunky yarn is that you really want to test your gauge. In theory, you should be doing this for all your projects. Do any of us actually do a gauge swatch for all of our projects? Every single one, every single time? Probably not, but we should. But with working with thick, chunky yarn, especially if you don't do it really frequently, your tension is going to be different. So the gauge swatch can do a couple things. It can help you just familiarize yourself with that specific yarn and get you comfortable holding it and holding your hook, making sure that you're staying consistent throughout your stitches in terms of your tension. And then obviously the purpose of the gauge swatch is to make sure that your final project ends up the right size. So if you don't care about the quote unquote right size of your project, then I guess do what you want. Don't do a gauge swatch if you don't want to. But I would say that it's going to be helpful for getting familiar with it and making sure that your gauge is consistent throughout. So even if you don't necessarily care about the final size, you probably don't want your project to kind of shrink and grow, which it can do if your tension changes throughout the project. So the gauge swatch is just a quick way to get familiar with the yarn and ensure that your tension is appropriate for what you want and consistent. If you're new to working with thick, bulky yarns, you probably want to choose a yarn in a lighter color to start with. Doing black is a little bit hard because when you're working with black yarn, it's harder to see where the holes are, harder to see where to insert your hook and how to work with it. So anytime you're starting with a new type of yarn or a new project, I do recommend typically working with lighter yarns first. It's just going to make your experience a little bit more pleasant and a little bit less frustrating. So a couple of troubleshooting things. I've noticed that when working with thick, bulky yarn, it's my tendency, at least, to crochet a little bit tighter, which can be good if you're wanting something with a tight weave that is nice and stiff, but it can make it harder to work in, especially the chain stitches. I find that my chains are a lot tighter, and then I have a hard time doing my first row of crochet. So if you're noticing that problem, there are a couple of options. The first one would be to just go up a hook size. Now, if you go up to a larger hook, but you're still like strangling the hook is what I call it, where the yarn is just really tight around the hook, it's still going to be hard to do your next row, right? So going up a hook size isn't going to fix it. You could go up a hook size for the chains and then go back to the normal hook size for the rest of your project. I've found that to be pretty helpful because my chain stitches often are a little bit tighter than the rest of my stitches. So sometimes I do that. Another option is just to try to crochet more loosely. So when you're crocheting, you have your loop on the hook, and if it's really tight, where it's pulled down around the hook like that, there's no space between the bottom of that loop and the hook, you're going to notice that it's harder to do the next row. So pulling it up and making it like a teardrop shape like this, where you have some space, is like intentionally pulling it up that little bit farther to get that teardrop shape is going to help you crochet looser. Now, sometimes it's hard once you get into the project and you're kind of mindlessly crocheting. We all do that. You can default back to your original, but being kind of conscious of that and keeping the hook looser, making sure that you have that teardrop shape on your hook is very beneficial. And then another option, I kind of talked about it briefly in the hook section, is to change hook materials. So in general, not always, but in general, the wooden or bamboo hooks, which are very beautiful, by the way, but they're a little bit grippier and they don't slide through the material as well. Plastic and aluminum are usually a little bit better. I find aluminum slides through the best, but there are some really good plastic hooks out there that could slide through really easily as well. So it's just something to consider if you're really struggling with it. You could try different hooks and see what you like the best. Another thing that I briefly mentioned is that when working with bulky yarns and larger hooks, you might experience a little bit more fatigue. You can get some soreness in your hands, your forearms. The size of the hook's nice because again, it's larger, but the weight, and if you're working more tightly and you're having to use more force to push the hook through and pull the yarn back up, you might experience some fatigue. So a couple things to address this. Make sure you're taking breaks as needed. If you do a 3-hour marathon crochet session, obviously you're more likely to have soreness than if you break it up into 20 or 30-minute portions. You can adjust how you're holding the hook, like I already discussed, pencil versus knife grip. And you may want to look for like an ergonomic hook or add a hook grip onto it just to bulk it up even a little bit more in terms of the size. Because sometimes if you're crocheting tighter, you're also holding the hook tighter, which if you have a larger handle will help. So I don't notice that to be a problem, but some people might. So another thing with bulky yarns to note is that sometimes they might just come out looking a little bit wonky. You can see the details of the stitches more with bulky yarns, but that means you can also see mistakes more. So you really want to make sure that you're counting properly, that when you're doing turning chains, you're being consistent with how many you're doing, if you're counting them as a stitch or not, where you're inserting your hook. It's going to be all more obvious because it's blown up, it's zoomed in, right? So it's going to be more obvious with the jumbo yarns. So just make sure you're being consistent with that. Now, some benefits of working with bulky yarns that I found. I really like working with them. The first reason is I'm very impatient, and working with bulky yarns makes for a lot faster projects. You get size a lot faster. So making a blanket with a jumbo size 7 yarn that's, king size or whatever is going to take a whole lot less time than making a blanket with, a weight 3 or 4 yarn. So that's something to consider if you're like me and very impatient. Working with the bulky yarns is very satisfying. There's a lot of immediate gratification in it. Obviously, the bulky yarns are also going to end up with like a thicker, more cozy, warmer end product. So that's nice if that's what you're going for. That's definitely a benefit of working with the bulkier yarns. It's easier to achieve that. You're also, again, gonna most likely end up with a stiffer project. So those bulky yarns are really good for something like a rug or a backpack where you do want it to be kind of a little bit more rigid than your drapey projects. So it's a great benefit of using thicker yarn for those projects. And then the final kind of benefit that I found with it is that you can see the stitches better. So the stitches are larger. Couple benefits of that is, number one, it can actually make it a little bit easier to see where to place your hook and how to create the stitch. So it's a good option for somebody who's really trying to learn those stitches. It also makes the stitch look, a little bit more textured, a little bit more detailed. So you can kind of get away with doing a simpler crochet stitch and it can still look very beautiful and polished at the end. So I think that's about all I have for talking about bulky, thick jumbo yarns. Again, that's size 5, 6, or 7. This one is a size 7. This is a size 5. This is a size 6. So they are all slightly different, but those are essentially the jumbo yarns or the bulky yarns. And if you have any other thoughts, tips, discussion, questions about working with thick, bulky yarns, drop them in the comments. I'd love to start some conversations there. And thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. Have an awesome day.